Hello everyone, this is Mrs. Archana Pradeshni, Assistant Professor, the Department of Information Science, Canara Engineering College. So in this module 2, we will look into certain concepts of multi-threaded programming, the idea about threads and what are the different threading modules used, along with the basic idea of process synchronization. Let's learn the basic objectives of this particular module. So the basic objectives are to understand what a thread is and how to differentiate between a process and a thread. What are the basic advantages and types of threads, and also to learn several strategies that provide the kind of implicit threading and any of the related issues pertaining to multi-threaded programming. And finally, we learn about the idea about process synchronization in this module. The general motivation of this topic is idea about multi-threading and the why there are benefits of using multiple threads compared to a single thread. So you can see that a thread is a flow of execution through the process code. So it has its own program counter which keeps track of what instruction to execute next, and also system registers, and the thread shares with its peer threads few information like code segment, data segment, and open files. So we know that thread is also a lightweight process. So each thread belongs to exactly one process, and no thread can exist outside a process. Each thread will represent a flow of control, and threads can be successfully used in implementing network servers or web servers. So this process creation is a heavy weight, while you can see thread creation is lightweight, and it can simplify the code and increase efficiency. So here you can see the difference between process and threads. The process uses many resources to as per the program, whereas thread it's just shares the resources that the process use, and therefore it's lightweight. Next point is about process switching. Process switching needs interaction with the operating system always, right? Whenever it switches from user mode to kernel mode, it requires the kernel intervention. Therefore, it takes much time, whereas thread switching does not need to interact with the operating system at all. And in case of a process, multi-processing environment, each process executes the same code but has its own memory and other resources, whereas all threads can share the same set of open files as well as child process and so on. Because for a process we'll have a particular thread, and if one process is blocked, then no other process can execute until that process has completed. So that is a major drawback. If that process was taking long time, the next process has to wait until the previous process has completed. Otherwise, it is blocked, right? Whereas in a thread, if the thread is blocked and it is waiting, a second thread in the same task can run. And the next difference about process and threads is that multiple processes without using threads use more resources, and multiple threaded process use fewer resources. And one thread can read, write, or change other data, whereas in multiple processes, each process operates differently. That is, one process will be writing the data, one process will be reading the data, but that is not the case in when you see threads. And threads use fewer resources, whereas process use more resources. And threads share a lot of the things like open files or child process. So that is these are the basic advantages when we say threads versus process. And this in threads we can observe that the context switching time is minimized. switching time, as it does not require any kernel intervention, and thread support is used for efficient communication, and resource sharing also is possible in threads, right? And all these threads, they are nothing but the basic processing unit to which the operating system allocates the processor time, and more than one thread can be executing the code inside a process. Let's say when a user double click an icon by a mouse, the operating system creates a process, and that process has one thread that runs the icon's code. Totally, each thread belongs to exactly one process. Here, just before you have looked into what exactly is a thread, and this idea of threads and process is very important to understand what is meant by multi-threading. So, as you're all aware about multitasking, which allows processes to run concurrently. Similarly, multi-threading means it allows sub-process or threads to run concurrently or parallel. Also, we can say that when multiple threads run concurrently, it is called as multi-threading. So, we have widely used programming languages like Java and Python, which allow developers to work on threads in their programs. So here you can see multi-threaded server architecture where a client requests some information to the server. The server can create a new thread to service that request. Let's say the client has opened a browser and he wants to search for some information in the browser. So that information request will be sent on to some other database servers. And the servers, if it's possible to locate the response, so it creates a new thread for to service that particular request, and then resumes listening for more requests from the client. So if still more, if the client tries to ask for the information from the server, again it creates one more thread. Like that, several threads will be created for a single connection or a single process. So you can say that this is in the case of scenario of multi-threaded server architecture. Multi-threading is a phenomenon of executing multiple threads at the same time. So again, we divide this into two types of thread, that is user level thread and kernel level threads. The first benefit of using multi-threaded programming is responsiveness. So what is this responsiveness? So if there is an interactive application, and if there is a concept of multi-threading used in this interactive application, so this program application may allow a program to continue running even if the part of it is blocked or if it is performing a lengthy operation. So thereby increasing the responsiveness. So here basically the threads provide benefit of responding to a request. So even if the thread is blocked, and the same operation can be continued by any other thread, thus providing the responsiveness or increasing the responsiveness. You can take an example of a web browser which still allows user interaction in one thread while an image will be loaded in another thread. So that way the responsiveness can be improved faster when we have got multiple threads which serve multiple requests. The next concept or the next benefit of having multi-thread programming is resource sharing. So threads will share the memory and resources of a process to which they belong. So however, process requires resources which are memory intensive and all, which are very costly, whereas threads just use the resources that the process use. So the benefit of code sharing is that it allows the application to have several threads of activity in the same address space. So whatever the address space the process is using, so obviously the resources will be shared from a process to several threads. That way it is very cheaper. The third benefit is economy. Economy in terms of cost. If we consider the allocation of memory and resources for a process creation, it is very costly. and threads will just share the resources of the process to which they belong. Therefore, we can say that the economy, in when you consider multi-threads or threading, it is very cheap. Next, about the utilization of multiprocessor architectures, or what we call it as scalability. So the process can take the advantage of multiprocessor architectures. So what is the benefit of having multi-threading is it can be greatly increased in a multiprocessor architecture, wherein each thread can be running in parallel on different processor. A single threaded process can run only on one CPU, no matter how much of them are available. But in multi-threading, we can increase the concurrency. So many such tasks can be performed concurrently. So if the it's like browser, if the user tries to browse an application, the user can try to play gaming, and user can perform an edit operation in Word. So several different threads are executed concurrently in such multiprocessor architectures. So these are the benefits of having multi-threaded programming in our real time. So thread can be implemented in different ways in user level mode as well as in kernel level mode. So in a user level thread, it is the user who manages the thread library. And we have got basic example of thread libraries like POSIX thread or Windows thread or Java threads. So in this user level threads, the thread management kernel will not be aware of the number of threads available, right? We are not aware about the number of threads in the system. But the thread library will contain the code for creating and destroying the threads, as well as message passing and data between the threads, and also scheduling of the thread execution and saving and restoring the thread context. So basic advantage of having the user thread is that thread switching does not require kernel support, and user level thread can run on any operating system, and scheduling can be application specific in the user level threads, and it is very fast and easy to manage and create such user level threads. Next, about kernel level threads, the thread management is entirely done by the kernel. So there is no thread management code in the application area, and kernel threads, they are directly supported by the operating system. Kernel maintains the context information for the process as a whole, and scheduling by the kernel is done on thread basis. So what does kernel do is it creates a thread, schedules a thread, and manages the thread in the kernel space, which are quite slower. The basic advantage of kernel level threading is that a kernel can simultaneously schedule multiple threads, whereas that is not in the case of user level threads. And if one thread in the process is blocked, the kernel can schedule another thread of the same process. And kernel routines themselves are multi-threaded. But the drawback of this kernel thread is it is slower to create and manage than user threads, and each require mode switch to the kernel. Any threading operation require mode switch to the kernel. So we have got some examples like Windows, Solaris, Linux, 264, Unix, and Mac OS threads. So let's see about multi-threading models. The operating system uses user level thread and kernel level thread. User level threads which are managed without kernel support, and there is an kernel level thread which are managed by the operating system. So there are different methods of mapping which are used by the operating system, and we have got Solaris, which is a good example of both the approaches. So multi-threading models are of three types, that is, it has many to many relationship and many to one relationship, and one to one relationship models. So let's see about many to one kind of multi-threading model. So many to one mapping means many user threads are mapped to a single kernel thread. So many user threads will be mapped to a single kernel thread as you can see in the picture. And thread management is done in the user space by the thread library. So in case if the thread makes a blocking system call, the entire process will be blocked because you can see that there is a single kernel and the kernel has to, only one thread can access the kernel at a time. So multiple threads will not be able to run in parallel. You can see some few systems which use this kind of many to one multi-threading model like Solaris and GNU portable threads, which implement many to one model, but few systems continue to do so. And the thread library will handle all the thread management. And many to one model does not allow individual process to be split across multiple CPUs. So this type of relationship provides effective context switching environment. So here you can see the user space and the kernel space. In this case of many to one model, so many user threads will be mapped to one kernel space. You can see that in kernel space there will be several kernel threads running, but for a particular process, exactly one kernel thread will be mapped. Next, there will be many processes in the user space. For each different process entirely, a new kernel thread will be mapped. But in case if the thread makes a blocking system call, if one thread blocks, okay, the entire any other thread won't be able to run, the entire process will be blocked and only one thread can access the kernel, right? And so the kernel will be crashed, obviously the entire process will be blocked. So that is the drawback of many to one model. But if user level thread libraries are implemented in the operating system in such a way that system does not support them, then the kernel threads use the many to one relationship modes. So the next kind of multi-threading model is one-to-one model. So in this kind of one-to-one model, one user level thread is mapped to one kernel thread. So if there are three user threads, then the system creates three separate kernel threads. So this provides more concurrency because of the separate thread. And in this method, the operating system allocates the data structures that represents the kernel threads. And the benefit is multiple threads can run in parallel in case of a multiprocessor systems. As the number of thread increases, more amount of memory is required. So that is an overhead because each time you need to create a new kernel thread. And the system performance will also slow down. So we have got this kind of model in OS/2 or and Windows NT and Windows 2000 and Linux systems. So here you can see the picture of one-to-one model. So in the user space there will be several processes, and similarly in the kernel space there will be several such kernel threads. And for each process there is one user thread that is created, and for each user thread there will be a single kernel thread. So you can imagine if there are 1,000 processes within the user space, there will be 1,000 such threads in the kernel space, and it takes long time to create a kernel thread, the biggest drawback. So the system performance gets slowed down in such case of multi-threading model. Next kind of model that is used in systems are many to many model. This is the third kind of multi-threading model. So here this multiplexes any number of user level threads or to an equal or maybe same number of kernel threads. So there will be same number of kernel threads or or such smaller number of kernel threads when compared to user level threads. And this kind of many to many model, it shows it here there are chances that there are 6 level threads are multiplexing with 6 kernel level threads. Okay, and in this model developers can create as many user threads as necessary, and the corresponding kernel threads can run in parallel on multiprocessor machines. So this provides best accuracy on concurrency, and when a thread performs a blocking call, the kernel can schedule another thread for execution. That is the main advantage in such a model. So we have got some systems which are making use of this kind of many to many model. So this kind of many to many mapping, it is also called as M to N thread mapping, and the concept of thread pooling is used to implement this method. So here blocking the kernel system call does not block the entire process, but the operating system design becomes complicated because for many user level threads has to be created, and small and equal number of kernel threads has to be created. So this is the there is a complexity in the construction of the OS. So here let's see the difference between user level and kernel level threads. So we have seen so far the user level threads and kernel level threads in different spaces of the operating system, and user level threads, they are quite faster to create because the user knows how exactly it is implemented, and therefore it is possible for the user to manage such kind of threads, whereas in kernel level threads it is quite slower to create and manage. For a process, each process there has to be a thread that is created between the user space and the kernel space, therefore it takes long time to create a kernel level thread, and the implementation is user specific, whereas in kernel level thread the implementation is supported by the operating system. In the user level threads, the thread is generic and it can run on any operating system, whereas if you take this kernel level thread implementation, it is very specific to the operating system because the kernel is specific to the operating system. And the last difference is multi-thread applications cannot take advantage of multiprocessing, whereas in kernel level threads the kernel routine themselves, they are multi-threading. Next is about the thread library. So far we have seen the different kinds of management model, thread management or multi-threading models. So now let's understand what a thread library contains before moving on to threading issues. So in this thread libraries, it acts as a bunch of APIs. So there will be bunch of APIs which are whose main responsibility is to create and terminate a thread and also perform some minor tasks. So there are two ways of implementing such kind of thread libraries. So the libraries may be implemented entirely in the user space or maybe in the kernel level library space which are supported by the operating system. And its thread libraries, we can have many such libraries like Java threads, or we can take the example of pthreads, which are POSIX threads, POSIX standard, or Windows threads or Linux threads. So currently, let's discuss about pthreads and Java threads, which are much more familiar. So the first thread that we are taking is a pthread, which refers to POSIX standard, and this defines API for thread creation and synchronization. So we have got several methods or functionalities which are useful for thread creation as well as synchronization and termination of threads. So this is the program given, wherein here you can see the different library header files which are specified based on the primitives given in the program, and we have also included a pthread.h header file that is basically to include all the pthread programs within the because all the pthread programs, they must include this header file pthread.h header file. And we have also got a statement called pthread underscore t tid in the main function. Just observe the main function. We have created pthread underscore t thread id. So what does it say is it is an identifier for the thread which we are going to create. So the thread that is created will have an id and it's of type pre-thread or POSIX thread, and it has got set of attributes like stack size or scheduling information. The first statement that is going to be printed is before thread. Before the thread, what happens is before thread it has to create a thread. How do we create a thread is by the help of the POSIX thread built-in function, which is pthread underscore create. So it takes the parameters like thread id and which is of type pthread underscore t, and each thread has got several attributes including priority and stack size. So the thread starts by calling the function. So that function is specified here in my thread func. Here you can just observe my thread fun is a function that is called when a thread has been created, and the argument that is passed to that particular function is here null. You can just observe next to the my thread function we have got an argument called as null. So all these threads or additional threads are created by pthread underscore create, and this the definitions of these are within the pthread dot h header file. So when this line is executed, the direct control flows over to my thread function, and you can observe that there is a primitive called sleep function, wherein the thread can sleep for certain amount of time, but there needs to be a header file which support this definition. So that is given in uni std.h, and it is next function is next it goes to print exquis from the thread, and after that we have got another function called pthread underscore join function. So any thread can be terminated by calling pthread underscore join function, and after the main thread will wait for the runner thread. There's a runner function always, and the main thread will always wait for the runner thread to complete by runner thread is which is a thread here my thread function. So this main thread will wait for this runner thread to complete, and by calling the pre-thread join, okay, and the runner thread will complete when it calls the function pthread underscore exit. So this pthread join function is called when a thread has to be terminated. So it terminates the my thread function and then completely terminates this particular thread which calls that function. You can observe the parameters are passed over to pthread join, that is thread id. And in Unix process, pthread create is similar to fork and pthread join is similar to wait PID. So pthread join means it has to wait for the runner thread to complete for, and it returns the status of the function. Next, next is the printf function after the thread and directly it exits. So here we have other subroutines which comprise the pthreads API, which are formally grouped in four groups for four categories. They are nothing but thread management, mutexes, condition variables, and synchronization. So what is this thread management? So these contains the routines that work directly on threads, maybe creating a thread or joining a thread or detaching a thread. So all the basic primitives on threads are supported in this thread management subroutine. And they also contain functions to set the thread attributes as well as scheduling of a thread. The next subroutine is which is used in the thread library is mutexes. So what is this mutexes is these routines they are related to synchronization called mutex. So it is a abbreviation for mutual exclusion that you must know about it. So mutex functions, what do they provide is they provide functionalities for creating, destroying, locking and unlocking mutexes. And next is the condition variables. So these routines, they are related to addressing the communications between the threads that share the mutex. So based upon the programmer specified conditions, so this group which includes the functions to create, destroy, wait and signal based upon the variables. So there will be several condition variables upon creation, destruction and wait process. Next, synchronization. These routines are basically involved in managing as well as reading or write logs for the threads. So these are the functions which are related to POSIX threads. It is pthread create, which we have already seen in our previous program, and pthread join and pthread self. So there are three more functionalities, that is pthread self, pthread detach and pthread exit. And there is also pthread sigmask. So pthread self, that is each thread has got an ID which identifies it within a given process. So this thread ID is returned by pthread underscore create function and it is used by pthread underscore join function. Okay, so each thread will have an ID which identifies it within the given process, and this thread ID is returned by pthread underscore create and is used by pthread underscore join. So a thread fetches this value for itself by using pthread underscore self. So you can see the syntax pthread underscore self of void. Next functionality is pthread underscore detach. So a thread will be joinable or detachable. When a joinable thread terminates, its thread ID and exit status are retained until another thread calls the pthread underscore join. So detachable thread, it is like a daemon process. When it is terminated, all its resources are released. So just see the syntax for pthread underscore detach function. So we have got a specific ID that has to be specified. That is, it has to release all the resources upon termination. And next is pthread underscore exit function. This is the way for a thread to terminate. Whenever a thread calls a pthread underscore exit, it returns the status of termination. Next, we also have got a pthread underscore sigmask and pthread underscore kill function. So several the prototypes for them are listed here. The pthread underscore sigmask function sets the signal mask of the calling thread. And in the signal mask we have got parameters like mode and 6 set value and also old stb value, and all these mode arguments, the values for this mode argument is specified in signal.h header. And pthread kill function sends a signal as specified in the signum argument. So these are all about the threading libraries. That is the first library, that is POSIX thread library. Next we'll be seeing about Java threads. So the next kind of thread that is in consideration is Java threads. So these threads are managed mainly by Java Virtual Machine, which is also called as JVM. So Java is one of the small number of languages which supports at the language level for creation and management of threads, right? So this Java JVM is not by user level library or kernel. So it is very difficult to classify Java threads as a user level library or kernel. So all the Java programs comprise of at least a single thread of control. So even the simple Java program consists of only a main method and it runs a single thread in the JVM. So you can see Java threads may be created by the runnable interface, and it's possible in Java to extend the thread class by implementing the runnable interface. So let's see about the concept of threading issues. So here we are going to discuss about the semantics of fork and exit system calls, which are used in a multi-threaded programming environment, and the idea about the issues related to thread cancellation, signal handling, and thread pool. Okay, let's see the semantics of fork and exit system calls. In a multi-threaded program, the semantics of fork and exit system call will change drastically. So in Unix operating system, if you just go to the versions of fork calls, there are two ways of understanding these fork system calls. That is, the fork call, it may duplicate all the threads, or in the second option, only the thread which is created by fork is duplicated. That is, based on the application, the system uses fork system calls. Actually, duplicating all threads is unnecessary. In case if we find that the exit system call is used immediately after fork, then there is no need for duplicating all the threads. The fork is a way of for an existing process to start a new one. But what about the case when where the new process is not a part of the same program? So this is where exit system comes into play. So what does exit system call do is, it replaces the contents of the currently running process with the information from the program binary. Thus the process the shell follows when launching a program is to firstly fork, creating a new process, and then exit the program binary it is using. So it works as normal. It just replaces the running process including all the threads. So here next is about the signal handling. As you know, signals, they notify that a particular event has occurred. Uh, Let us tell something more about the signal handler. So signal handler, it is used to process the signals. So first of all, we have got three ways of doing the same things. Signal will be generated either by a particular event, and when it is generated, it is delivered to a process, and signal will be handled by one of the two signal handlers. Either it will be handled by the default or the user defined, and at a specific event the signal will be generated, and the generated signal is sent to a process, and there's a signal handler to handle this delivered signal. In this, once again, we have got two types, that is asynchronous and synchronous signal. So synchronous signal means, for example, if you take division by 0, that is an example of synchronous signal. So these signals are delivered to the same process which perform the operation by generating the signal. And in case of asynchronous, terminating a process with certain keystrokes are the signals that are generated by an event external to the running process. So synchronous signal is sent to the same process, whereas asynchronous signal is sent to another process. I think this you must be knowing. What is meant by, what is the difference between synchronous signal as well as asynchronous signal, right? Okay. So every signal has a default handler, and that kernel will run when handling the signal. In case if there is no handler specified, the kernel is going to invoke the default handler, and the signals may be handled in different ways. That is, the some signals may be ignored, and other signals may be handled by just terminating the program. Signal handling, where should a signal be delivered for multi-threading. So there are some conditions as to how the signals can be delivered. So thread applies the signals and are received by the signal. To deliver the signal to the thread to which the signal applies, or deliver the signal to every thread in the process, or deliver the signal to just few threads in the process, or assign a specific thread to receive all the signals. So what could be used, what strategy could be used, how could the signals be delivered? So that is a major issue, and there is a specific method for delivering a signal, depends, and this depends upon the type of the signals generated. So synchronous signal is sent to the thread which causes the signal, and all threads receive the asynchronous signals. Next is about the thread cancellation. So cancellation means it allows one thread to terminate, or it is a task of terminating a thread before completion, and that thread which is used to cancel is called as a target thread. And here again we have got two approaches. So before talking about these general approach, let's see how this thread cancellation can be demonstrated. Let's say user has opened a web browser and he just presses a button that stops a web page. If you just recall, when you have opened the browser for some research, let's say uh, whenever you search for some information, so that particular information is unavailable, and by some means your browser gets stuck up. So let's say you have opened 3 or 4 tabs in that same browser. So what happens is, even though a single thread is not working, the entire browser closes off. So that is called as a thread cancellation. Okay, so if there are multiple threads and they are concurrently searching to the database, and one thread returns a result, the remaining threads might be cancelled. So another situation, if I want to say, is if a user presses a button on the web browser and that stops the web page from loading. So even the user presses the stop button, the thread loading that page will be cancelled. So now let's see the two approaches for thread cancellation. One is asynchronous cancellation and deferred cancellation. In asynchronous cancellation, one thread immediately terminates the target thread, and in deferred cancellation, we can say that there is some particular amount of time which can be delayed, so that the target thread gets some opportunity to terminate itself. So that is the difference between asynchronous and deferred cancellation. So this is just a small code. You can just see this is a pthread code which creates a thread, and during creation it calls the worker function, and its argument is set to null. And there is also pthreads also have some points called as cancellation points. This is just to allow a thread to check if it should be cancelled at a point when it can be safely cancelled. So their pthread also provides deferred cancellation, and most of the operating systems allow a process or thread to be cancelled asynchronously. It offers a solution to both the problems of thread life cycle overhead and also the problems of resource thrashing. So in a multi-threaded environment, you might have observed that it is very easier to create several threads rather than to create several processes, because the overhead is almost reduced. And the first concern that is taken into consideration is the amount of time required to create a thread. So that is very much less when you see the time required to create a process. The second issue is if you allow multiple requests to be serviced in a new thread, that we have not placed any bound on the number of threads active in the system. there will be many threads which would make use of the resources like CPU or memory. And one solution to such kind of issue is thread pool. So what a thread pool do is it groups the CPU resources and contains threads used to execute the tasks within that pool. So here you are going to create any number of threads at the process startup and place them into a pool. So they will be sitting and waiting for work, and whenever the server receives a request, it will awaken a particular thread from this pool. And if one is available, it passes on the request to the server. And once the thread has completed, it returns to the pool waiting for more work. So if the pool contains no such available thread, it has the server obviously has to wait until anyone becomes free. So what are the benefits of this thread pool is servicing a request with an existing thread is usually faster than waiting to create a thread, and the thread pool size is fixed. You must remember that there will be limited number of threads which exist at a point, and we are going to service the threads are being the work is being solved with the existing number of threads in the thread pool. So next concept is about process scheduling, and as you know, OS must allocate the resources among the computing process. The resources will be allocated obviously by means of scheduling. That is, it determines which process will have to wait, which process has to take in charge of the CPU and progress. So the resource provided by the processor is execution time. What is the main objective of scheduling is it shares the time fairly among the processes and prevents starvation of a process and makes the processor use efficiently and have lower overhead. So in this way it can prioritize the different processes whenever necessary, serving the real-time constraints. And for this there are different scheduling queues. The OS maintains all the PCBs in the process scheduling queues, because as you know, for each process you have got a PCB, and OS maintains a queue for each of the process states, and the PCB will be updated for each state of the process. So there will be three kinds of queues. One is the job queue, wherein it gives all the processes in the system, and next what we have is ready queue. So this queue is responsible for keeping the set of processes which are ready to take the CPU, or which are residing in main memory, and ready and waiting to execute. So this will be always put in the head of the queue. The third kind of queue is a device queue. So the process will be either waiting to get access to the particular device. So these processes which are blocked due to unavailability of an IO device, they are nothing but moving into this particular queue. Uh, Here let's talk about the CPU scheduler. In a multi-programming environment, usually more programs will be executed, right? And there are chances that different programs are trying to access different resources. So why the CPU scheduling is required is to increase the CPU utilization time. If one program is taking long time to run, so in that case several other short programs may have to wait. So there has to be a decision or a policy which is scheduled by the operating system so as to make the processor efficient. So in CPU scheduling, it just switches over from one process to another process. So in this, for this, the CPU resource management is commonly known as scheduling. The user program will contain the combination of CPU burst cycle as well as IO burst cycle. So process will start with the CPU burst cycle and then move to IO burst cycle again in the middle, and again it may start with the CPU burst cycle and so on. So this process continues. So that is the way how the program execution sequence follows, right? First of all, you may have the CPU burst cycle. Next, maybe the processor wants to access the IO device, so it goes to IO burst cycle, and so CPU bound process will tends to use the processor more. Okay, and whereas IO bound process tends to use the processor only briefly before generating an IO request. So there is a scheduler called as a CPU scheduler, or it is also called as a short-term scheduler, and this selects the process in the ready queue and allocates the CPU. So scheduling mechanism is a part of the process manager that handles the removing of the running process from the CPU and selecting another process. So how are these decisions affected is decisions may take place whenever it moves from one state to another state, maybe from maybe the process has switched over from running state to waiting state. In that way, in that case, the scheduler plays an important role, or in sometimes where it has switched over from the running state to the ready state. So that time also it invokes the short-term scheduler, and in the third case where it switches over from waiting state to ready state, and finally if it terminates. So scheduling under first and fourth, they are called as non-primitive. Non-primitive means the operation usually proceeds towards completion uninterrupted. So there is no preemption in the operation. So it continues as and when the process wants to get over the CPU, it takes the CPU and then completes its execution burst time and then proceeds to the next process which requires access to the CPU. So that is what is meant by non-preemptive. And here in preemptive scheduling, that means it interrupts the processor for some particular time or maybe for up till the burst cycle completes and then transfers the CPU to another process. So here switchover takes place from running state to ready state, and again it may wait for some IO event, so it goes to the waiting state and then comes back to the ready state for next execution. So all of the states you can observe step 2 and 3, that is referred to as preemptive. So usually the preemptive process moves from running state to ready state, and the next it may start waiting for an IO event and then come back to the ready state. As scheduling under first and fourth, they are non-preemptive. Another component which involves in the CPU scheduling is the dispatcher. So what exactly is this dispatcher is? It is a module which gives control of the CPU to the process selected by the short-term scheduler. The short-term scheduler is going to select a particular process, and who does this task is the dispatcher, which gives control of the CPU to a process is selected by the short-term scheduler. So what are the functionalities which are involved during this process is switching context, switching to user mode, and then jump to a proper location in the user program for restarting that program. So dispatcher is usually a small program that switches the processor from one process to another, and there is some latency or the delay during this kind of switches. That is because dispatcher has to switch the processor from one process to another process, right? For that some amount of time is reserved during this context switching. So dispatch latency, so that particular time is called dispatch latency. So dispatch latency is a time taken by the dispatcher to stop running one particular process, start over the other process running. Okay. So let's differentiate between CPU bound process and IO bound process. So in case of CPU bound process, they are implementing the algorithm with large number of calculations. Whereas in IO bound process, the process are mostly waiting for the completion of the input or the output, and they are IO bound, and that takes quite less particular amount of time. Whereas CPU bounded process, they are huge involved in the calculations, and it takes lot amount of time to perform this CPU bound process. And CPU bound process, they are given low priority by the scheduler. Whereas if you just observe the IO bounded process or any other interrupts that is given by the operating system, it is given the highest priority. And in CPU bound, it does too much of computation to keep the IO busy, whereas IO bound does too much of IO to keep it busy. So one example I can give for CPU bound process is about matrix calculation. And here the only the two matrices are required as inputs. That is, it requires an IO device. Rest all the time the CPU is busy calculating the performing the calculations, and therefore it is a CPU bound process. And one good example for IO bound process is Netscape. Okay. So different CPU scheduling algorithms, they have got different properties, and we need to choose a particular algorithm in a particular situation. So characteristics as to select the best algorithm is based on these criteria. So what kind of scheduling has to be used? Let's say the CPU utilization is one characteristic. This is the criteria for selection of scheduling, or what kind of scheduling. First one is CPU utilization, second is throughput, third is turnaround time, fourth is waiting time, and finally we have got response time. So in CPU utilization, most of the time we want to keep the CPU busy as possible, right? And CPU utilization may range from it may be 0%, or that is it may be idle, or it may be 100% busy. So in real time system, it would be nearly around 40 to 90%. So this is one basic criteria for which we determine what kind of scheduling has to be used. The next criteria is throughput. So throughput tells us how much rate of work done in a per unit time. So if the CPU is busy executing the process, then the work is being done, right? And one measure of this work is the number of processes completed per unit time. So how many processes have been completed per unit time? So that gives the throughput. So throughput might be 10 processes per second, and this rate may be one process per hour for short transactions. Next is about the turnaround time. So this turnaround time, it tells us that is from the point of view of a process. The important criteria is how long it takes to execute that process. How much time is taken to execute a particular process. So that is the turnaround time. I can say that turnaround time starts from process submission to completion. Or turnaround time is nothing but burst time plus waiting time. Whereas throughput tells the number of work. If more work is done by the system per unit time, that means more throughput. Okay, turnaround time is just the start. There's a time taken from process submission to process completion. Therefore, it includes also the burst time plus maybe the waiting time. And next is the rest waiting time. So, what is this waiting time? CPU scheduling algorithm does not affect the amount of time during which a process executes. It affects only the time that the process spends waiting in the ready queue. How much time is spent in the ready queue, that affects the execution. And waiting time is the average period of time a process spends waiting. So it is normally in the ready queue wherein it waits a lot. So it can be said as the sum of periods spent waiting in the ready queue. And the last one is about response time. So this can be set as, for example, in an interactive system, the turnaround time may not be the best one. So often the process can produce some output early and then can continue computing the new results while the previous results are being output to the user. So another measure is the time from the submission of request until the first response is produced. That is called the response time. If the response time is quick, we can say the system is fast. So this response time is the time taken, that is the time from the submission of a request, okay, until the first response is obtained. That is the response time. And so these are the important criteria for CPU scheduling. And there are also other criteria like fairness. So fairness, that is, it can avoid the process from starvations. That is called as fairness. That means all process have to be given a equal chance to execute. So there comes your fairness. That also has to be followed in any scheduling algorithm. And the next property is priority. Obviously, if the operating system it assigns priority to the processes, then the scheduling mechanism will favor the higher priority process. So that also has to be given much more importance in, especially in the case of real-time system. And next criteria is about predictability. So we need to know, a process has to know how much time it needs to take for its execution. That is, a given process should run in about the same time under system loads. For example, it is given a burst time of 10. It has to execute for 10 seconds. And so in generally we want to maximize the CPU utilization and throughput, and to minimize the turnaround time, waiting time, and response time. What are the major algorithm optimization criteria? First of all, the CPU utilization should be maximum, and also the number of work or the amount of work completed per unit time must also be more. That is nothing but the throughput. And turnaround time, it is nothing but the time taken for the submission of process until its completion. So this has to be less, right? And there should be minimum amount of time that the process is waiting in the ready queue. And finally, the response time of a process must be minimum. That is, it should take less time to respond. So only then we can say that that's an effective scheduling algorithm. So let's come to the first kind of scheduling algorithm, that is the first come first serve scheduling. So what does this say is, it is the most simplest algorithm and it is first come first serve. That means with this scheme, the process that requests the CPU first is allocated the CPU first. So usually when a process enters, okay, into the queue, it will be in the PCB will be in the linked to the tail of the queue, right? When a process enters, the PC will be linked to the tail of the queue. And when the CPU is free, it is allocated to the process at the head of the queue, correct? And the running process will then removed from the queue, because from the queue it has moved to the CPU for execution. Okay, and the average time that will be taken for FCFS is often quite long. Why? Because you can see that here there are three processes, okay, three processes, and see the time taken, it is almost is 17 milliseconds. Average waiting time, it is 17 milliseconds. Okay, and the waiting time is differs from one process to another process. You can just observe. So FCFS, it is not useful in scheduling interactive process because it cannot guarantee short response time. Is it possible to have short response time? It's not possible. So it is purely a non-preemptive. That is, it it basically does not stop whenever you want to stop it. It is a non-preemptive scheduling algorithm. It is also called first in, first out. So whenever process waits, it is removed from the queue and queues up again in the FCFS queue and gets up ready. So even the turnaround time is unpredictable with FCFS algorithm. You can observe that it goes in a first in first order manner. So here the first process P1 has got the burst time 24 milliseconds, and next we have got process P2. See, all these processes will be waiting in the ready queue. Okay, so first P1 will be in the head, and all the three processes will be waiting in the queue. So first chance for the process that comes into the CPU is process P1 because it is first in, first out, or first serve. So first process P1 will be there in the CPU, and it will completely take over the CPU, execute up till its burst time, that is 24 milliseconds, and then only after it has completed, next the remaining two process was there in the queue, right? P2 and P3. Now whose turn it is to come into the CPU is process P2 comes into the CPU, and it has got the burst time 3, even though you can see it has got the lowest burst time 3 milliseconds, yet it has to wait for 24 milliseconds of process P1, and that means it is not useful for interactive systems or real-time systems. P2, see, it has got 3 milliseconds. So after process P1 has completed over of 24 milliseconds, process P2 executes for further 3 milliseconds. So it has to wait for 24 milliseconds. Process P2 has to wait for 24 milliseconds, whereas process P1 is the first process and it has no waiting time, 0. Whereas process P3, it has to wait still more. So you can observe P1 and P1 has completed the CPU, it releases all the resources and gets out from the CPU. Next P2 comes into the CPU. Okay, then after it finishes it goes out, and then process P3 comes into the CPU. Okay, and it completes over 3 milliseconds, and you can just observe the time it has to wait. Versus P3 has to wait 27 milliseconds, even though it has got the short burst time. And the average waiting time is just sum of the waiting times of all the processes. So here we've got three processes. Process P1 is 0, the process P2 is 24 milliseconds, and process P3 is 27 milliseconds, just average or divided by the number of processes. Here we have got three processes, so by 3 it is around 17 milliseconds. So if we just try to change the order, that is, if let's say process P2, P3, P1, if we try to change the order, what will be the average waiting time? If you just think over, what you get is, let's say process P2, the order of the processes are process P2, P3 and P1. In that case, the waiting time of process P2 is 0, waiting time of process P3 will be 3 milliseconds, waiting time of process P1 will be 6 milliseconds. The average waiting time is 0 plus 3 plus 6 by 3 over 9 by 3, that is 3 milliseconds is the average waiting time if we just reverse the order of the process arrival, that is if we give P2, P3 and P1. So the average waiting time of FCFS policy is generally not minimal and it is non-preemptive. So it would be disastrous to allow one process to keep CPU waiting for a long amount of time. That means the CPU is not responding to the services of other requests. So let's move to another kind of scheduling algorithm wherein the average waiting time can be minimized. let's see about this kind of scheduling algorithm. So this is a kind of, here we have got two different versions between preemptive and non-preemptive. So in SJF, this is a different kind of approach in which the algorithm associates with each process the length of the CPU burst, length of the latest next CPU burst. So what happens in this kind of algorithm is, when the CPU is available, it is assigned to the process that has got the smallest next CPU burst. So in case if two processes are having the same length of the next CPU burst, in that case the FCFS scheduling will be used. So this kind of scheduling algorithm is also called as shortest job next, or SJN scheduling algorithm, because it handles the process based on the length of the CPU burst time. And SJF is purely non-preemptive, and it is used frequently in long-term scheduling. Here, whenever a process requests the CPU, it must inform the system for how long it wants to use the CPU. And when the CPU becomes available, the system allocates into the process with the least execution time. So there is also a preemptive version of SJF, which is also called shortest remaining time next. So in preemptive version, it is going to preempt the currently executing process, whereas in the non-preemptive version of SJF, it will allow the currently running process to finish its task. So SJF is an optimal and gives minimum average waiting time for a set of processes. But the real difficulty is to know the length of the next CPU request. Here there are four processes. Process P1 is having the burst time 6 milliseconds. Process P2 is having again 8 milliseconds, and process P3 is having the burst time as 7 milliseconds. Process P4 takes 3 milliseconds of burst time. So what can be inferred from this is how this is executed. Basically SJF, that is non-preemptive version, how this is executed. You can just see the Gantt chart or scheduling chart. Here the process P4 is having the shortest burst time. You can observe among all the processes, process P4 is having the shortest burst time, that is 3 milliseconds. So P4 is going to come into the CPU and stay there, execute for completely for 3 milliseconds, and the next shortest CPU burst time, that particular process, let's here after P4 it is process P1, right? It is which is having the next shortest CPU burst. So P1 is arriving at 3 milliseconds and it will execute for over 6 milliseconds. That is the next process which is having the shortest CPU burst time. So which is the next process having the shortest CPU burst time? We have got process P3, right? Process P3 is having the next shortest CPU burst time. So that will come into the CPU, stay there, completes its execution for over 7 milliseconds completely, and take the charge of the next process. The next process and the last process that will take over the CPU is process P2, which completely executes for 8 milliseconds. So the average waiting time, so for process P1 the average waiting time is 3 milliseconds. For process P2 the waiting time is 16 milliseconds. Okay, for process P3, it has to wait for 9 milliseconds, and process P4 is going to wait for 0 milliseconds. So can you calculate the average waiting time? The average waiting time is 0. The average waiting time is 3 for process P1, okay, 16 for process P2, and 9 for process P3, and 0 for process P4. So 3 plus 16 plus 9 plus 0 by the total number of processes, that is 4, which is around 7 milliseconds. So just you can observe, if you are using FCFS scheduling, the average time would be over 10 milliseconds. Same algorithm if it was replaced by FCFS. So SJF scheduling algorithm is always said to provide optimal solution. That is, it gives the minimum average waiting time for a set of processes. It just moves the short process before the long one. So the waiting time of the short process decreases more than it increases the waiting time of the long process. But the real difficulty is to know the length of the next CPU request. So just observe that this is the version of preemptive SJF. So in preemptive SJF, it is going to preempt the currently executing process, and it is also called as shortest remaining time first. Shortest remaining time first algorithm. So in this case, you can observe that there are 4 processes and their arrival times and the burst time is mentioned. The process P1 is having the arrival time 0, that means it arrives at 0, and the burst time is specified as 8 milliseconds. And process P2 is also having the arrival time 1, the burst time is set to 4 milliseconds. And process P3, whose arrival time is 2 milliseconds and the burst time is specified as 9 milliseconds. Process P4, whose arrival time is 3 and the burst time is set to 5 milliseconds. So if you try to draw the Gantt chart, so how would the process possibly arrive? So first thing is that has to be considered is the arrival time here. So as you know that process P1 is having the arrival time 0, so that comes into the queue, or that takes charge of the CPU first. Okay, process P1 will arrive at time interval 0. But how long does it execute? Does it execute for 8 milliseconds? No. It tries to preempt whatever it is doing because it finds that the next process P2 comes at its arrival time 1. So process P2 arrives at arrival time 1, and then does it continue for 4 milliseconds? Yes, it continues for 4 milliseconds. Okay, it continues for 4 milliseconds because the next one is having the long burst time. The next process is having the largest burst time. So this is going to complete its execution. This is going to complete its execution. And then this goes on continuing. So next process P3 doesn't execute. Next it will see the next process. Okay, process P4 has got burst time 5. So P4 will enter after immediately at the tail of P2, that is after P2 completes. So at the arrival time 5, process P4 comes into the CPU and then completely executes for 5 milliseconds. And next, so far we can find that P1 process has still 7 seconds of burst time and 7 milliseconds of burst time, and process P2 is completed process. P3 is remaining with the 9 milliseconds burst time. So which among process P1 and P3 has got the shortest burst time? it is process P1, right? So it will be in the tail of the queue. So process P1 comes into the CPU and then executes completely for 7 milliseconds. Next, which is the process that comes next after this process P1 is the last process, that is process P3, which goes to completion for 9 milliseconds. And you can see the waiting time of process P1 is 0. Process here, how do we calculate the waiting time is based on the arrival time too. So the burst time of process P1, the waiting time of process P1 is 0. So and the arrival time is see, the waiting time of P1 is not 0. You can observe that P1 arrives at 0, but again it comes again at 10 milliseconds. So what is the waiting time of process P1? It is 10 minus 1, right? 10 minus 1 minus the arrival time. What is the arrival time of process P1? 0. So it is 10 minus 1, that you can observe in the line below there. Okay, next for process P2, if you try to calculate the waiting time, process P2 is waiting for 1 millisecond. So 1 millisecond wait time minus the arrival time, that is 1 minus 1. Okay, and then for process P3 is waiting for how many milliseconds? It is waiting for 17 milliseconds. And what is the arrival time of process P3? It is 2 milliseconds. So therefore 17 minus 2 is the average waiting time. And then for process P4. What is the arrival time? What is the waiting time for process P4? Process P4 waits for 5 milliseconds minus what is the arrival time for process P4? Arrival time is 3 milliseconds. So we have got waiting time as 5 minus 3. So if we try to calculate the average waiting time for this particular process, we get 10 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1 plus 17 minus 2 plus 5 minus 3 whole divided by the number of processes. So here the number of processes are 4. So you just divide by 4, which equals 26 by 4, that is around 6.5 milliseconds. So let's see another scheduling algorithm, that is priority scheduling. So what is this priority scheduling is? It is a kind of preemptive, okay, because it preempts based on the priority, right? There will be certain number or priority number which is given to a process, and the CPU is allocated to the process with the highest priority. Let's say equal priority processes are there. So in what order that process scheduling happens is by FCFS order. So SJF algorithm is simply a priority algorithm where priority is nothing but the inverse of the next CPU burst. So larger the CPU burst, the lower the priority, and vice versa. So we can have scheduling in terms of higher priority and lower priority. So priorities, they are usually some fixed numbers, and it is usually a non-negative integer number such as 0 to 7 or 0 to 4 and so on. And the major problem that occurs with priority scheduling is indefinite blocking or starvation. What is this starvation? It is that the lower priority processes may never execute as long as when the CPU gets all the different processes with a higher priority, lower priority process will stop. That is, they are not able to execute or not able to get the CPU. Okay, so it can, this kind of algorithm can leave some low priority processes, they are waiting indefinitely for the CPU. So in that case, the computer system is loaded with the higher priority process and just can prevent the lower priority process. So solution to this is aging. So what is this aging? It is a technique of gradually reducing or gradually increasing the priority of the process that wait in the system for a long time. For example, if we have got the priorities from 127 low to 0 high, okay, so we could decrement the priority of a waiting process by 1 every 15 milliseconds. So if we say the number 127, And if you have the number 0, so 0 is referred to as a higher priority and 127 is referred to as a low priority. In that case, it's possible to decrement the priority of the waiting process. Whichever process is waiting, we can decrement the priority of that process by 1 every 15 minutes. So even the process with the initial priority of 127 would have the highest priority in the system and may be executed. So that's the possible solution of starvation. So here there's a so there is a question wherein there are 5 processes and a burst time is set to corresponding values, and there is also a priority set. Okay, so we have got 5 processes, and process P1 is having the burst time as 10 milliseconds and priority is set to 3. Okay, and process P2 is the next process which is having the burst time 1 and priority is also set to 1. Process P3 is having burst time 2 milliseconds and priority is set to 4 milliseconds. Process P4 is having burst time 1 and priority is 5. Finally, the fifth process P5 is having burst time 5 and priority is set to 2. So this is the Gantt chart. So this is the way in which the processes can be scheduled. So priorities can be defined either internally or externally. Internally defined priorities, they use some measurable quantity to compute the priority. For example, there may be time limits or memory requirements or the number of open files. So external priorities, they are usually set by the operating system, like which of the process has to execute first and what is the type of policy or any other political factors. Okay, priority scheduling again here can be preemptive or non-preemptive. So whenever process arrives at the ready queue, its priority is compared with the priority of the currently running process. If the priority of the newly arrived process is higher than the priority of the currently running process, then it is preempted. Okay, so here you can observe that among the 5 processes, the first process P1 is, even though it is having burst time 10, its priority is 3. Okay, and then process P2, if you just compare, its burst time is 1. And also the priority is also 1. That means it is the first process that has to take over the CPU. Process P2 comes into the CPU, completes the execution. What is the burst time of that process? It is 1 millisecond. So it completely executes for 1 milliseconds. And then after that, the any other process which is having the highest priority is given the chance. So after process P2, it is the process P5 which is having the highest priority. So 1 refers to high priority and 2 refers to the next higher priority. So process P5 gets the next chance to take over the CPU and it completely executes for 5 milliseconds. And so far now process P2 and P5 have completely executed. Next we have got these processes P1, P3, P4 remaining in the queue. So among P1, P3, P4, if we take in the first in first order manner, so P1, it is the process P1 which is having the highest priority, right? The next higher priority. So it completely executes for 10 milliseconds, and then after the completion of process P1, then you have got process P3 which completely executes for 2 milliseconds. You can observe the priority for process P3 is again the next higher priority after P1. And the last process that has to be executed is process P4 which is having the burst time 1 milliseconds and with the low priority. So the average waiting time of the process will be, what is the waiting time for process P1 is 6 milliseconds, and what is the average waiting time for process P2 is 0 milliseconds. It is 6 plus 0 plus waiting time for process P3 is 6 16 milliseconds, waiting time for process P4 is 18 milliseconds, and waiting time for P5 is 1 millisecond. If you try to sum up all these values, 6 plus 0 plus 16 plus 18 plus 1, okay, divided by 5, what do we get is, we get around 8.2 milliseconds. So in this kind of scheduling algorithm, it is a it is basically a preemptive scheduling algorithm, and it is used in all the interactive systems. So this kind of algorithm it is similar to FCFS, but preemption is added between the process. There is a certain time interval called as time quantum is defined, and it is generally from 10 to 100 milliseconds. So there will be a ready queue, and it is treated as a circular queue, and the CPU scheduler goes around this queue, allocating the CPU to each process for the time interval from 1 to the time quantum. So to implement this RR scheduling, so we keep a ready queue as a FIFO queue of process, and new process will be added to the tail of the ready queue, and CPU scheduler picks the first process from the ready queue, sets the timer to interrupt for one time quantum, and then dispatches the process. So in case the process are having CPU burst time of less than one time quantum, in this case the process itself will release the CPU. Whereas if there is if the process is having more CPU burst, it has to stop for this time particular time quantum. So let's see the particular problem. If there are n process in the ready queue and the time quantum is q, so each process will get 1 by n of the CPU time. No process waits more than n minus 1 to q time units. So in this particular problem, the time quantum is set to 4 milliseconds. So you can observe that there are three process P1, P2 and P3, which are having the burst time 24, 3 and 3 respectively. And the Gantt chart can be given as follows. So even though process P1 is having more time to execute 24 milliseconds, it has to preempt the CPU and give the CPU turn to the next process. So process P1 will come into the CPU first, and it remains there for 4 milliseconds, and after 4 milliseconds it switches over to the next process P2 comes and gets over the CPU and executes for 3 milliseconds completely. It executes for completely the burst time. It does not require more time, so it executes up till the burst time 3 milliseconds, and then switches over to the next process, that is process P3. So now process P3 will execute for 3 milliseconds and stop. So now what about the next process? We have got only another process called as process P1, which has to execute for still 20 milliseconds. So process P1 executes in this particular time slot. So process T1 will execute for 4 milliseconds in 5 slots. So now if you try to calculate the waiting time, so how much time does process P1 require? What is the waiting time of process P1? You can observe P1 has arrived first, and next to the next point it is going to arrive some point later, right? So the waiting time is 10 minus 4. Next process P2, waiting time is 4 milliseconds, whereas process P3 is 7 milliseconds. If you try to calculate the average waiting time, it would be 10 minus 4 plus 4 plus 7, that is 6 plus 4 plus 7, or 17 by 3. What is 17 by 3? It is 5.66 milliseconds around. So overall in RR scheduling algorithm, no process is allocated the CPU for more than one time quantum, and if the process exceeds one time quantum, in that process is preempted and put back in the ready queue. So here you can see the process time, and process time is set to 10 milliseconds and the time quantum is 12. So here there is no such context switch because the entire process just takes 10 milliseconds to execute. It is less than the time quantum. In the second Gantt chart, you can observe that there are two processes, and the time quantum is set to 6 milliseconds, and each process and the first process has the burst time of 6 milliseconds. Second process has got the burst time of 4 milliseconds. So it executes up till the burst time, just avoiding the time quantum. So there are just one context switch from one process to another process. And you can observe in the third Gantt chart there the time interval is 10, but the quantum is set to 1. Each process is executing just for 1 milliseconds, and the context which is that is required is 9. So another class of scheduling algorithm is nothing but multi-level queue scheduling. So multi-level queue is not a separate scheduling algorithm, but it works in conjunction with several CPU scheduling algorithm. So one type of multi-level queue is based on the priority based. So system consists of two types of processes or jobs, interactive and batch usually. So interactive jobs are shorter and batch jobs are longer. So in order to keep minimum response time for the user, the interactive jobs are scheduled before the batch jobs. That's why we see here the interactive jobs are before the batch jobs. The ready queue is partitioned into two separate queues, interactive, which is nothing but the foreground, and batch jobs, that is your background jobs. So once the job assigns to the queue, it will remain in that queue and jobs never change that queue. So batch jobs are put in one queue called as background queue, while the interactive jobs are put in the foreground queue. So batch jobs will be scheduled by first come first serve method, and interactive jobs, as you know, will be scheduled by Robin round method. So the scheduler has to decide which queue to run, right? So the methods are followed. That is, high priority queues can be processed until they are empty before the low priority queues are executed. That is one possible method wherein the scheduler can decide which queue to run. And in the other method, that is, each queue will be given certain amount of CPU. Maybe the interactive queue would be assigned 75% of the CPU, while the batch would be given 25%. Okay, so this kind of multi-level queue scheduling algorithm, it partitions the ready queue into several queues. You can see all these queues here, and the processes are permanently assigned to one queue, generally based on some property of the process, maybe priority or process type or size. So each queue will have its own scheduling algorithm for different purposes. So the multi-level queue scheduling algorithm with 5 queues are given below: system process, interactive editing process, batch process, and student process. So each queue has got absolute priority over lower priority queues. So the first higher priority is system process. Okay, and the lowest one is the student process. No process in the batch queue, for example, could run unless the queues for system queues, interactive processes, and interactive editing process are empty. So if all of them are empty, like system process, and interactive process are empty, only then batch process can run. So in that priority, this multi-level queue scheduling works. So in this multi-level feedback queue scheduling, the the processes are permanently assigned to a queue on entry to the system. So what happens in this multi-level queue scheduling is it allows moving the process between the queues. So it will have number of distinct queues and each assigned a different priority level. So at a given time, a process that is ready to run is on a single queue. Uses priorities to decide which process should run at a given time. So the basic idea of this kind of scheduling is to separate processes with different CPU burst characteristics. So let's say if a process uses too much of the CPU time, it will be moved to the lower priority queue. So this scheme leaves IO bound and interactive processes in the higher priority queues. Similarly, a process that waits too long in the lower priority queue may be moved to the higher priority queue. So consider, let's see this example with the help of a diagram. Before that, let's see the parameters in which the scheduler works. It is based on the number of queues and the scheduling algorithm for each queue, the method which is used to determine when to upgrade a process to the higher priority queue, the method used to determine when to demote a process to a low priority queue, the method used to determine which queue a process will enter when that process needs service. So these are the parameters in which the scheduler decides. And here you can see the same example with the help of diagram. How many we have got here? 3 queues numbered from 0 to 2, let's say. The scheduler first executes all the process in queue level 0, and only when queue level 0 is empty it will execute process in queue 1. Similarly, process in queue 2. So queue 0 is defined. What is the queue? RR with time quantum 8 milliseconds, and queue 1 is RR time quantum with 16 milliseconds, and queue 2 is FCFS scheduling. So new job enters into the queue. The process that arrives for Q1 will preempt a process in Q2, and a process that arrives for Q0 will in turn preempt a process in Q1. Okay, so a new job that enters into Q0, which is served in FCFS manner, and when it gains the CPU, it receives 8 milliseconds. That means it is completed. If it does not finish in 8 milliseconds, the job is moved to Q1. At Q1, job is again served in FCFS manner and receives again 16 milliseconds. If it does not finish, again it moves to the next queue. This is how the multi-level feedback queue works. So in this multi-level feedback, it gives highest priority to any process which with a CPU burst of 8 milliseconds or less. Such a process will quickly get the CPU, finish the CPU burst, and then go off for its next CPU.